So Professor Alison Young is going to talk to the title Art or Crime, or both at the same time. And she's conducted extensive research on graffiti and street art. She's a visual criminologist by background. She's the author of Street Art, Public City, which I recommend, and co-author of Street Studio. And she's been researching street art and graffiti as both art form, crime, and as a feature of city life. So Professor Young researches in social and political sciences at the University of Melbourne and is also Honorary Professor in the law school at City University here in London. She's also author of Judging the Image, and I would particularly recommend Street Art Public City, because I think it adds a very kind of nuanced approach to thinking about the situatedness of, or situational qualities of street art and graffiti, which is the term that Professor Young uses. And I think her work really talks about the way in which street art and graffiti relate to questions of citizenship and publicity, the public image. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Professor Young. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben, and let me say also thank you to the organisers who've done such an amazing job in bringing all of us here for the next 3 days, and particularly thanks to Lorraine and to Marcus, and very much special thanks to Sabina, who's been such an amazing force in bringing us all together, and also to Danny and Chloe in the organisation. So I'm talking to this title, but I do want to flag at the beginning that I'm using it in an ironic way, and I'll come back to all the reasons why I hate posing the dichotomy between art and crime. So please take the title with many grains of salt right from the beginning. So as some of you might know, I'm a visual criminologist, as Ben said, and so my work has mainly been about images. And I draw upon a number of different fields in order to do my research, and those would be cultural criminology, socio-legal studies, and aesthetics. So I'm sort of laying this out as a bit of background to what I'm going to talk about in my discussion today. I was told I was speaking on the illegal sessions day, and I decided I wanted to think about the law and property in public space. So in thinking about those things, I have drawn from cultural criminology and from the work done by people like Jeff Farrell, an interest in how social groups construct identities through cultural practices, some of which get deemed to be illicit and some of which are legal, but they're always creative and interpretive. And in terms of thinking about the law, from socio-legal studies, I have taken paid a lot of attention to notions of context regarding the emergence of laws, specifically in relation to the laws which target graffiti writing and street art, and I'll be talking in some detail about that today. And because these are images that we're talking about, these are public images in city spaces, I have been paying a lot of attention to aesthetics as well, because we're not just talking about a broken window. It could be performance art, I guess, if you break a window. But on the whole, there is a distinction that I really want to hold on to between any kind of illicit graffiti and street art, whether it's a wavy line along a wall that someone's drawn with a marker pen, or whether it's a more elaborate wild-style piece. There's a difference between that and between something else that could be classed as criminal damage, because we're talking about images. So from aesthetics, I've been working with the idea of that the spectator has an encounter with the image, and that encounter produces affect. It produces intensity in the spectator, which then is interpreted as a series of emotions through which social value is transmitted. So this is something of the background to the research that I've been doing, I guess. I've been working on graffiti and street art since 1996, when I moved to Melbourne. And Melbourne, for those of you who don't know it, is a huge centre of graffiti and street art. When I moved there, it was mainly political graffiti that was on the walls. So there was a comment earlier today about how graffiti was rarely political, but Melbourne actually is the counterpoint to that, because people wrote political views all over the neighbourhood that I lived in the late 90s. But in the mid-2000s, I also started following the emergence of a different cultural practice, which we now tend to call street art. So I've been researching that, excuse me, and I was lucky enough to get funding from the Australian government, from the Australian Research Council, to travel around and speak to artists and writers in a number of different cities. I keep feeling that the Australian government perhaps meant to tick the box of the name of the person next to me on the list, but instead they ticked my name, and so I was given research funding to do this, for which I'm very grateful. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is to make a number of propositions, and then I'm going to try and think through some of the implications of each one. So the first proposition is that there is no difference between a corporate logo and a tag. So here is some paint on a wall, and it was painted by each of the owners of the walls. These are all different houses, and they either painted it themselves or agreed with the council that this be painted this colour. And when I was living in this street, there was a controversy occasioned when one of the property owners said that they wanted to paint their little bit pale green. So it was a white row of houses up to a certain point, and then one of them said, "I'm bored with white. I want it to be pale green." And then a debate ensued amongst the property owners in the street about what effect would this pale green section have in the middle of the white wall. So here is some more paint on a wall. It forms tags painted by unseen graffiti writers that will be painted over by the council. And here they are, painting it over. And here is some chalk on a wall, and it was put there by a street artist who was about to have a gallery show. So it's done by a street artist, but it's actually the name of her show, and so in some ways it's a form of advertising. Here is what looks as though it's painted on a wall, looks as though it might have been done by a street artist in an abandoned building. In fact, it was cardboard attached to a wall of a vacant lot near Farringdon in London. And it is, in fact, an advert for a furniture shop, which is located across the road. And here's more paint on a wall, located in New York, but photographed and viewed online by thousands of people. And here is some more paint on a wall. This is in London, obviously. I'm sure most people in the room know where it is, where it was. It was a stencil put up by Banksy, covered with plexiglass. Its presence led to a section of the wall being cut through with power tools, and then the work being offered for sale at an auction for £500,000, and then the site of the artwork then being revised by comments on what had happened to the original artwork. So how do we know, through all of these examples, how do we know whether paint on a wall is graffiti or street art or advertising or public art or decorative embellishment? So I would argue that we need to pay attention to a number of things. First of all, there's little that distinguishes one set of marks on a wall from another in themselves. Distinction, the ability to tell the difference between a tag and a corporate logo or an advert and so on. Distinction's an effect of a series of judgments made by the spectator, by those who interact with the wall or with other property near it, or by the city authorities. So the crucial factors in these judgments are who has authorized the work, to what extent does the image conform to existing genres of appropriate imagery for the space, does the paint take certain forms, like is it a mural in a particular style, is it paint that is situated in a certain spot on a house wall, and so on. And all of these questions relate to property and to propriety, propriety being our sense of the rightness of doing things. So if we try to argue otherwise, any other position actually posits an essence to the tag or to the logo. So the idea that that a tag is always a tag and we can always work it out as such, whereas a corporate logo should never be thought of as similar to a tag. So although there are differences in authorization between a corporate logo and a tag, I think that we need to be more flexible in our thinking, that we should actually embrace a kind of messiness of conceptualization in relation to each of them. So we should at least be prepared to say, what would happen if we started talking about corporate logos as if they were tags? Or what would happen if we gave the tag the same kind of symbolic standing as an advert does? So given that there's a social hierarchy in which the makers of tags are always at the bottom, and the makers of logos and adverts often gain a lot of money for that labor, I think that there's an onus upon us at least to engage in the thought exercise of trying to flip them around and ask that what-if question. So my second proposition is that damage is a euphemism for a challenge to property ownership. So damage names both an effect and a state of mind. And I'm talking here, I'm a lawyer by training originally, so I'm talking with the lawyer's hat on for this section. So damage as an effect gets defined in the law. We heard a little bit about that mentioned in the discussion earlier. It's something whose removal requires time and labor, or it causes the functional derailment of an object. I think that's such an awesome term. I just had to put it in there just to say it, because functional derailment is a very legalistic concept. So if you remove a manhole from its location in order to gain access to a drain, the manhole is functionally derained while the cover has been removed. So that's the way the law thinks about damage. Time and effort to remove, even if it's chalk on a pavement, even if it's mud on a wall, nothing that's permanent, nothing that requires chemicals or money and so on, it's still damage because someone had to spend time and effort in removing it. So as a counterpoint to that, what are the motivations of people that create illicit marks in public space? Are they seeking to do damage? So do they have what the law considers the required state of mind for making illicit marks in public space, for doing damage? So I interviewed about 64 artists and graffiti writers in cities such as Berlin and New York and London, Melbourne, Paris, and I asked them about their motivations for making illegal work in public space. And I'll just mention quickly the main things that people said. So the majority were inspired by some other aspect of culture. So that was mainly graffiti culture, so seeing Style Wars or buying Subway Art, the book, or seeing graffiti around them was what made people want to get involved with it themselves. And a lot of other people were inspired by stencils or inspired by punk or skateboarding or comics to get involved in street art. So there's an awareness of the cultural form and a desire to join in. Many also thought that it was a form of communication, and there were various ways that this was expressed. They talked about communicating with other people in the city, so other city residents, about making a mark on the city, communicating with the surfaces of city spaces. Many were trying to explicitly communicate the message that art could be democratic and accessible, that you didn't have to go to a museum to see it. And many were also engaged in expressing political views, so making a political communication. And for many of them, it was an aesthetic question, that they believed in this cultural practice as a form of aesthetic, that they were contributing to the city, they were making it more beautiful, they were adding to it, and so on. And I think that's really important. I was listening this morning to people talking about damage and vandalism and to cleaning trains and cleaning surfaces. Cleaning is a contingent notion. It is subjective. If you are a graffiti writer or a street artist, cleanliness does not come about from the absence of graffiti. Cleanliness is whether or not someone's peed in the corner of your train carriage or whether or not there's litter on the floor. Cleanliness is not about whether or not there might be a tag next to the seat that you're sitting on. And so writers talked about trains that had been cleaned or walls that had been cleaned. Writers called them drab, empty, grey, boring. And some of them actually said they're waiting for someone like me to come along and make them look better. So that's a very different sense of aesthetics from the kind of aesthetics that are implicit in some of the surveys and so on that were being mentioned in relation to transport. Many others talked about pleasure. So I've called it corporeal pleasure. It's a kind of catch-all term for the myriad sources of enjoyment that people found in doing graffiti or street art. They talked about how a can feels in your hand, or the smell of paint, or the sound that the can makes when you shake it. So people talked about their pulse rate going up if they heard someone else shaking a can. These are the products of affect and the products of desire and pleasure. And so if we're trying to think about joined up social policy and so on, you have to try and find a way to include desire, affect, and pleasure in the policies that we create, because otherwise there's just going to be such a huge gap between policy making and law on the one hand and the corporeal pleasure that people derive from it on the other. And then I wanted to mention finally that many of the writers and artists I spoke to saw themselves in opposition to something. It wasn't necessarily that they were opposing it through doing damage. I want to really emphasize they didn't see themselves as damaging. They saw themselves as using a mechanism that could express opposition to a range of things. And that might be authority, it might be private property laws, it might be advertising. And for some, there was a certain pleasure in the fact that it was illegal. So they were, opposing the law in some ways. But again, I would say that none of this is about damage. But the problem is that criminal law doesn't think like that. So all of this richness of motivation is irrelevant if you come into the courts of the law. Intention or recklessness as to damaging property and the relationship between the writer, the image, and the property owner, those are the only things that count as far as the law is concerned. I'll just go back. In English law, the main offence for covering illicit mark making is the Criminal Damage Act 1971. So intention or recklessness to destroy or damage property belonging to another. Damage isn't defined in the statute. It kind of emerges through case law, and we get to the position where it's time and labour of removal or functional derailment. Where I live and work in Victoria, in Australia, there's a very similar offence, and Victoria has also created some specific anti-graffiti provisions, which it calls the Graffiti Prevention Act, where it criminalises a range of activities such as possessing an aerosol can or marking graffiti is what it calls it. It doesn't define it as damage, it simply defines it as marking. So on the one hand, you have offences which are about damage to property, and on the other hand, Victorian legislation, which is really about what it considers antisocial behaviour in the sense that certain social values are being offended against. This situation has led to harsh approaches in criminal justice to graffiti and street art. I'm going to come back to this later, but I just wanted to float it now. So we heard about some of the sentences that have been handed down in English law recently. Same in Victoria. Victoria has the harshest anti-graffiti provisions in Australia. MPs said proudly in debate that they were glad that this offence was being dealt with more seriously than assault, because it was time someone took damage to property seriously. And what we're seeing at the moment is that Australian police are actually charging people with very, very old offences. So it's not just catching people for what they're doing now, but a couple of writers that I know have been served summonses for activities that took place more than 10 years ago. So the police, like elephants, sometimes we can say that the police don't forget. And it seems to be at the moment that if there's a dossier on a writer and artist that goes back in time, that can lead to harsh sentences being handed down. So there's a writer facing court tomorrow in Melbourne, and I'm quite anxious to hear what happens to him for one stencil that he did in 2004. Now, my third proposition is that illegality has its own hierarchy. And here we get to the situation where street art becomes valued more than graffiti. So I guess the value I've been talking about thus far has been the value of property in contemporary society. But now I want to pay attention to the fact that street art is valued differently than graffiti. So as far as the law is concerned, there's no difference between them. Both involve placement of objects onto property belonging to another, or the alteration of property through the addition of something like aerosol paint. So they both create illicit images on property belonging to another and without consent. So where we get mural projects and so on, what's happening there is that the property owner gives consent through the provision of a legal wall or by commissioning an artist to do a particular artwork. So it doesn't actually change the legal position. The law creates within it little pockets of exceptionality where you can get round the basic prohibition on altering someone's property. And what you've created is a small exception that actually ends up proving the rule that anything without consent is a crime. What I'm interested in, I guess, is the way that at the same time as the law has its own exceptions to its prohibitions, there are also social processes that take place whereby some illegal activities become informally, it's not so much decriminalized, but you could say informally legitimated. And I think what's been happening in the last few years to street art is that it is benefiting from a kind of informal cultural legitimation. So there's a dichotomy that's forming, or maybe it's better to say there's a dichotomy being hardened between street art and graffiti. There's long been a separation between them. Graffiti writers and street artists tend to see them as different practices with different histories and cultures and so on. In terms of the mainstream media, graffiti is easy to represent as a social problem, as a crime, as a youth activity or a subculture. And street art increasingly, thanks to the activities of people like Banksy and so on, and thanks to the David Cameron, Ben Ine, Barack Obama, Shepard Fairey sort of nexus, as a form of art. So it's often categorized as a kind of low art or folk art or not quite art, but it's also sometimes seen as an urban intervention, a little bit like guerrilla gardening or yarn bombing, like maybe a bit Islington, maybe a bit sort of countercultural. But it's not, like when people talk about fear of crime, public space, public funding, cleaning and so on, they tend not to be thinking of stencils, they tend to be thinking of tags. So at that base level, this dichotomy is really getting not just set in stone, but really embedded in policy. So what you can see on the slide is the state government of Victoria in Australia. This is their website statement of their four-pronged prevention strategy. Offenders removing graffiti, provision of cleaning kits to all residents, council and community partnerships, and funding for any kind of graffiti removal initiative. So that's fine. That's an ideology. It's an expression of an ideology. What's interesting is that at the same time the state government funded street artists as part of, in connection with the National Gallery of Victoria's survey of contemporary art in Melbourne last year. So the state government provided funding through the gallery to street artists to commission murals in one of the streets in the city centre. And so $20,000 was given to the artist to cover the cost of paint and cherry pickers and so on. And so there you can see a proud statement about the importance of street art. So I think that's an example of the art-crime distinction at work. Is it helpful? I would actually say that what it shows is that at best there's confusion about how to think about street art and graffiti, and at worst what we might call hypocrisy. So it's a distinction that's been around for a long time, art versus crime, but it used to be posed as a question that people were trying to work out in relation to graffiti. Is it art? Is it crime? You know, is Basquiat different from Warhol, and so on, these sorts of issues. But it was about the status of graffiti. What we're seeing now is that it's being used to separate graffiti off from street art, and it's being used in a way that that justifies harsh treatment for those who fall into the graffiti category and more lenient treatment for those who fall into the street art category. And so this is my fourth proposition, which is that street art benefits from discrimination in criminal justice practice. So, as I mentioned, as far as the law is concerned, there's no distinction between street art and graffiti. It's placement of an image without permission on property belonging to another. So any uncommissioned image falls into the category of property crime. So in law, this evolving distinction between street art and graffiti should make no difference. But in the research I've been doing, there's evidence that actually decisions made by agents of the law and agents of criminal justice are deeply affected by the opposition between art and crime. And they're using it to treat more fairly people that they can categorize as street artists. So one example would be, I talked to artists and writers about the encounters that they've had with police. So a recurrent theme was that you had to position yourself as a street artist. You couldn't be suspected of being a graffiti writer because that would lead to all sorts of unpleasant experiences. So in Berlin, a stencil artist called El Boccio said, you have to make them understand it's only art and you're only an artist. You mustn't let them think you're a graffiti writer. And then Ben Ein, whom we all saw this morning, so when I interviewed him, he talked about how, as you heard him say in the film, he wanted to keep painting and he thought to himself, I have to be a little bit clever. What can I do? So stop graffiti, move into street art. So in New York, Jordan Seiler, who does public advertising takeovers, talked about what it's like interacting with the police when they can see him doing an ad takeover, when they can see that he's been rewriting billboards or altering billboards or removing adverts and replacing them with artworks, and that they are pretty calm in his interactions with them. But as he points out, on the occasions where they thought that he was a graffiti writer, then their treatment of him is a great deal more physical and a lot more violent, and he ends up, spending a night in the cells. In Rome, Alice Pasquini, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, told me that she was painting a wall one day and a resident called the police saying that there was illegal graffiti taking place on the street. And the police turned up and they said to Alice, we thought we were coming to arrest a graffiti writer, but now we're here, we can see this is art, we can see it's beautiful, we don't want to fine you, so we're going to just write on this piece of paper, we're just scribbling on it, and it looks as though we're fining you, and why don't you go away for a little while and you can come back later and finish it. So does any of this matter? So I think it does, and it matters in quite subtle ways. So it matters because it puts the onus on the artist being able to talk their way out of an encounter. And the way that they talk themselves out of that encounter is that they have to perpetuate the art-crime distinction. I think it also might have effects on the art that we see on the walls around us. So it might produce a drift towards user-friendly art that's easy to like, easy to justify, easy to live with. It's also, I know, earlier people were talking about how can it be that we have this situation where people end up in court and they're treated in this way. And so the other part of my research in this area involved looking at what happens when people can't talk themselves out of an encounter and when they do end up facing a judge in court. So I analysed a lot of court decisions where people had been charged and had ended up before a magistrate. So what was happening was that the magistrate goes a little bit ballistic. They finally got a graffiti writer in front of them. And the magistrates say things like, I see graffiti on the trains every day and I hate it. Everyone hates it. Here you are. It costs us £300 million a year. I'm going to make an example of you. So the phrase that came up over and over again was, I have to make an example of you. The other phrase that came up again and again was, I'm doing this to send a message to all of the other graffiti writers out there. So the individual in court stands in for this hidden, shadowy population of graffiti writers. The judge is so thrilled at the chance to sentence one of them that they end up infringing a lot of the rules about sentencing. So people turn up in court for a first offence, and I found a number of cases where the judge goes, I'm not supposed to send you to prison, but I'm going to do it anyway. Or there's a ceiling on what kind of fine I can give you, but I don't care because I think this is so awful and everyone hates it. I'm going to fine you $30,000 and so on. And if people have the social or financial wherewithal to get an appeal going after that, that all the cases where appeals were made in that situation, the sentences were all reduced or sometimes dismissed. So it's clear that when somebody lands in court, that there is like a moment of affective intensity for the judge. And I think this is something that we need to pay more attention to, and perhaps practicing lawyers, defense lawyers, need to try and take preemptive steps with their clients before they go to court. My fifth proposition is that when we try and locate an uncommissioned work in the street, it can be a complex business. So this is by me really trying to argue that we shouldn't take for granted what illicit work might look like, although we might have lots of assumptions about it. Because the law also finds it difficult to know how to respond to words and images on walls. There have been a number of high-profile situations where legal work has been mistakenly cleaned off. So Anthony Lister famously did a piece with permission that the council came along and buffed. Or the plumber in Melbourne who drilled through one of Banksy's last rats in Melbourne. And that was a kind of oops situation. Or the council cleaner who removed a Banksy rat in the centre of Melbourne. The deputy mayor went on television and apologised to the city for that one. So there's lots of uncertainty about how do we know when something's illegal, when it's legal, or it was illegal but now we like it and we want to keep it. So I'm trying to think through a number of ways, of issues that arise when we're determining illegality and presence. And I wanted to use an example of the street round the corner from where I live in Melbourne. So here we can see three different things in this picture. Closest to us, there's a very large mural done by permission by a crew called AWOL. And the main artist is a guy called Adnate, and he's the one that's done the large figure, and the other members of the crew have done some of the embellishments. Next to it, going further away from the camera, is a piece, a wild-style piece. And then further away, harder to see, but I've got another image of it closer up, but there's more wild-style graffiti further away on the apartment building. So the piece by Adnate was done with, you can see it better in this image. So it's done with permission. It's on a hairdresser's building, so hairdressers will be the tenants, but whoever owned the building gave permission to this being done, and it's become a kind of local landmark. Tours stop off at it and people photograph it, and a lot of people, just passers by, stop and take pictures of it. and it's been there about 3 years. So when we move further along, there's this huge wild style piece, and that's been there for over a decade. And I don't know the guys that did it. I know it was done without permission, but it's still there, and neither of these pieces attract much revision in the form of tags. Anything that does appear is very, very small. So they've managed to, one has achieved a threshold through the consent of the property owner, and the other has achieved a kind of threshold through, it's almost like consensus. We like this, and we want it to stay there. So here's the building that you could see in the distance on the previous slide. So this is a block of flats, and it's a development by some local architects. So it features graffiti, wild-style graffiti as part of its design. Any tags or paste-ups that get added to it are removed. Opposite it, there's a fruit and veg warehouse, and it's got a large drip tag, it's got paste-ups, it's got a cat by Lush, it's got all sorts of things on it. And then over the road from it, there's this private house, which gets repeatedly hit up by taggers. You can see it's got a CCTV camera attached to its sidewall in an attempt to deter the taggers. It doesn't work. They paint it over, and then the taggers come back. So within this small area, there are all these different things going on. So Adnate's mural had permission, so authority comes from the consent of the property owner. The graffiti piece looks as if it has permission, probably. And the kind of ersatz graffiti on the apartment block, it's meaningless, I think. It's become a pattern. It's pure decoration. Its relation to graffiti culture is so tenuous that it's hard to know what it's doing there. And then finally, with this house across the road, the owners clearly are policing that wall very intensely. The wall across from it, which has the Lush and so on, clearly the owner of this wall is indifferent to what's put on it, and so the person with the CCTV camera has control only over their own wall. They can't do anything about what they look at on their neighbours. So by highlighting the diversity and variety of interventions and images just in this small section of the street, my aim is to try and show how difficult it is to talk about street art and graffiti with any precision. So the risk is that we end up making sweeping generalizations that homogenize a variety of practices. And what we're also risking is flattening out the various legal statuses that might attach to images in public space. Work done with permission, work done without, work done initially without permission, but then the owner decides to keep it, indifference by the property owner, commissioned work, imitation. When we talk about street art and graffiti, we have to keep imagining the streetscape that these are located in. And we have to keep ensuring that we imagine the streetscape as mobile, uncertain, changing, and subject to a range of claims as to value. So this is my final proposition, which is that valuing street art over graffiti is dangerous. So I want to take up this question of value that was in the subtitle of my paper. So the value that's being attached to street art as art has consequences that extend far beyond the question of legitimacy. So the activities of street artists are getting mediated by art professionals into a new art movement, and then their products can be traded at considerable profit, and street art can be called urban art, and then can provide a livelihood for art professionals. It can be a source of inspiration for architects, graphic designers, musicians, product manufacturers. And its new status in the cultural field has many concrete effects, whether it's new galleries, an industry of walking tours, a burgeoning trade in purloined artworks, and so on. So some of these they're based on, I guess, a confusion as to what is the object that's being traded. So street art originally is as illegal as graffiti, and yet the idea of trading graffiti in the way that we've become accustomed to with street art is much harder to think through. So I really think that we should try to step back and try to denormalize our familiarity with street art. So despite the expanding cultural legitimation of what we call street art, the continuing illegal status of graffiti keeps bringing me back to the origins of its controversial nature. So it's all about property. I really do think that a lot of the discussions about safety and fear and so on actually take place on the surface of deeply held views about the sovereignty of the property owner and the affront to that sovereignty that graffiti and illicit mark making represents. And if writers and artists have been put in the position where, if they're not to deal with the consequences of that deeply held view, they must present themselves as exceptions, that they're artists, not criminals, street artists, not graffiti writers, that they have legitimacy rather than being vandals. And their success depends upon the discretion of the individual resident, the individual police officer, the individual judge. And here we see some of the consequences of the hierarchy between the two. So this is in Berlin, which used to have had such a reputation for the importance of graffiti to the end of the wall and so on. But here we see a resident who was scraping every single sticker off a lamppost. And then we get streetscapes that look like this. So this is a version of the buff where something has been painted over by a property owner. Does that look better than it would if it was tagged? I'm not convinced that it does. And then we have the whole relationship of street art to gentrification. No one talks about graffiti and gentrification, but street art and gentrification is has a well understood relationship now. And then I guess as a final sort of demonstration of some of the dangers of valuing street art highly is the very idea of the Royal Doulton street art range offends something very deeply in me. But perhaps there's always been this group of people who felt hard done by because they didn't have crockery that drew on this aesthetic. So to finish up, I guess, to come back to this question, why does it matter? How should the implications of my propositions be understood? So I think that this is about thinking through the effects that they have on city spaces and citizens. And we need a means of understanding key aspects of the everyday life that we experience in cities. And graffiti and street art and the way that we respond to them actually offer us some really interesting ways of thinking through our expectations of city life. So here we can see a number of instances of our confusion around how to understand city life, playing out for real individuals. So here's a graffiti writer being made to paint over his tag. So his body is put in a particular place and he's made to do certain things as a result of our not knowing how we think about graffiti and street art. I took this recently in New York. This is a paste up by Adam Cost, who was a big-time graffiti writer in the 90s and who was caught and who did time in prison, stopped for a number of years, but then decided to come back and go very hard. And so the NYPD have been desperate to catch him, and in October they did. So I took this photograph of one of his pasted up images above a whole set of bill posters, which bill posters apparently we don't see them, or the police don't see them, but they do see Adam Cost's paste ups. And so that resulted in his arrest and being charged with a range of offences because of the invisibility of bill posting in comparison with street art. And then we have this, which is also in New York, a Banksy work under plexiglass with a CCTV camera to protect it against being removed, being tagged over, and so on. So where does this confusion and uncertainty come from? So I think street art and graffiti are primarily about space. And as spatial activities, they're spatial activities that make images in public. And to do so without authorization challenges the legitimacy of certain activities in city spaces, owning property, moving through it, and altering it. We're licensed to move through it in a range of ways. On the tube, but not writing on the tube. To walk past someone's house, maybe you're allowed to lean on someone's house if you're tired and so on, but you're not supposed to write on someone's house or stick paper on it. A number of people who do engage in these activities, they talk about their relationship to the surfaces and the spaces as authorizing them. They feel authorized because they are users of the spaces. And I think this is what the law, the media, the police, there's no understanding of this. And I would like to suggest this might be an avenue that we could explore in the next few days. What rights does use of city spaces give us as the users of cities? That we move through them, we walk through them, we stand in them, we sit in them, we look at them. Are we simply supposed to travel through with no ability to alter or respond to them? You could say that, of course, councils will allow you to make applications for planning permission to change your house or to submit a design for a mural competition and so on, but none of that actually recognizes your right as an individual to make images. It makes your image making dependent upon permission given by someone with the authority, who always has that authority and who only licenses you temporarily to any change in your environment. So I would like to propose, as a final proposition, why does it matter? Because we are all in cities, and wouldn't it be great if we were given more autonomy and less delegitimization, that's a big word, less undermining of the people who respond to cities by wanting to make something else of them. So instead of saying, how can we prosecute them? How can we punish them? How can we stop it? I think that if we said, what is the harm? Is it interesting? Can I learn about tagging? Can I learn to read the tag? Can I practice it? Can I understand if it's hard or easy? If those questions were less unusual, then perhaps we would have progressed towards a more public kind of city. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was a really wonderful talk and really full of fascinating insights and clear thinking, I think, which will be really helpful for our discussion now, but also I think as we continue and the conversation unfolds over the next few days. I think these propositions are very provocative, and there's a lot of thought and research that have gone into these ideas, and I think in particular sort of complexifying not only our understanding of the marks or images themselves as material things, but also thinking about the social context in which they're produced and these questions of labour, as well as the questions of the structures through which they're governed and managed, and these questions of dealing with, I think all of your examples are notable for the complexity and this kind of layering of different images, which reveal the dynamic ways that images and cities are interacting with people, and circulating in complex ways. And it's difficult to talk about these things. And I think not only with street art and graffiti, but with lots of other kinds of image as well. And thinking particularly about these quite ambiguous or ambivalent images is a really productive way forward. And I'm sure lots of people have questions, but perhaps while you're framing your questions, I could start by asking you a number of things. Well, I mean, on the one hand, I thought that your provocation at the end there, you're really suggesting that, in a way, well, on the one hand, we need to ask what do street art and graffiti want in terms of how we understand them, and we need to perhaps radically rethink the way that they're understood and governed. But on the other hand, you're suggesting at the end there that we might ask something of these images as well, that they have a positive role to play, and at the moment that perhaps we're being treated as kind of customers rather than citizens, and that these forms of image making can help us somehow appropriate our status as citizens. I don't know whether that's. I hope I've interpreted your argument correctly there. But I mean, one question that came up for me was around this approach of talking to artists primarily about their work, and this, the research being led by questions of motivation and intentionality. In a way, that seems quite unusual if you think in terms of art history, that often we're told that actually that's the last place that you look if you want to understand how images are working. But in this case, it seems very important. So that was something that struck me. I didn't know whether you had any comments about that.
I guess it's an area where motivations are imputed to people, often with no basis. So, I mean, the law does this in its definition of criminal damage. So, I thought that it was almost like an ethical responsibility to try to go behind the law, to try to see what artists, graffiti writers said themselves. Something that's producing, to each other, I think. Yes, really. Something that's producing feedback. Does that still work? Can people hear? Yeah. So, it obviously, when I started out, I didn't know any graffiti writers. I'm not a graffiti writer, and so it was hard to meet them. It certainly was in the 90s anyway. Maybe it's easier now as part of the increasing familiarity of it. But I didn't know how to hang out on the train lines and wait for some to come along and so on. And I wrote to a number of online graffiti forums saying, "Hi, I'm a criminologist. We'd really like to interview you about why you do graffiti." And I got some really interesting responses, mainly along the lines of, "Fuck off." And people sent out warnings that this was a cop and so on. Absolutely justified. Like, what a stupid thing to do. Hi. You know. So this is a world where people it's high stakes. We've been hearing earlier, it's high stakes. If you get caught, you can face, bad stuff. And so I don't know what I was thinking going, hey, talk to me. And so I was lucky enough to have a student in one of my classes who said, "Would you ever like to talk to my ex-boyfriend? He's a graffiti legend." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And the thing was that he actually was a graffiti legend. It was a guy called Puzzle, who was one of if anyone knows anything about Australian train graffiti, he really, really was a king. And so he was my first interviewee. And then because of that, he acted like a gatekeeper into the world of graffiti for me. And I would meet people and I would say, "Oh, Puzzle said I should talk to you." And they'd go, "Oh my God, like, what's he like? Puzzle." So it's that facilitated my entry into that world. But I always felt that it was really important that with a world like this, where assumptions lead to imprisonment, and I just didn't want to come anywhere near perpetuating that process. So I always wanted to include the voices of the artists, even though it's not fashionable in art criticism terms.
Thank you. And in terms of this question of affect that you raised, which I think is really important, if you're suggesting then that somehow if we rethink our approach, then street art and graffiti have this possibility of somehow opening up a new collective imaginary of the city, then And that kind of moves us into talking about the affect that images produce in people that are receiving the work. I was wondering if you could comment on how you approach that in your research. We've been talking about questions of authorization in terms of the law, and you articulated that really precisely for us. But what about authorization in terms of local communities, considering the question that we're addressing today?
Yeah, so it's a complicated issue, and I didn't want to approach the question of the spectator's response to the artwork. I didn't want to repeat any sort of prejudices that I might have. I didn't want to say, if you don't like it, you're wrong. I really wanted to try and understand what people might not like about it. And so if people react really strongly against street art, if they feel it's being imposed upon them and they would rather not see it, what's that about? It comes out of a certain way of thinking about the city, which is perhaps highlighting certain aspects of it and not paying heed to others. It might be something that's become overly accustomed to advertising, or that doesn't realize that public architecture is often the result of fashion and who's got money and who hasn't, and so on. And so the conversations that I had with people as spectators were very much about the nature of the intense affect that they might have, either for or against street art and graffiti. And in some ways it can be boiled down to the fact that it became very tedious to hear people saying, I don't like tags, but I do like murals. And there's a wish that's often expressed where people say, I wouldn't mind it if we could only have murals or if we could only have stencils, because they're funny, they're nice, but I really hate tags. And so I do think the tag is an incredibly interesting example of, in some ways it's the most acute issue in this whole field. That if people could stop being bothered by tags, then the conversation would progress enormously.
Can you talk further into the microphone, please?
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think the other thing that struck me just before I open up to the audience was this question around graffiti as dirt or not. And you've stated very clearly it's not dirt, but then it is part of a kind of system of order and disorder and decline and renewal, and we need to think about it perhaps relative to, or it's helpful sometimes to think about it relative to other kinds of categories of dysfunctionality or blight, or and I think certainly in London, one of the complexities around this distinction that's been made between street art and graffiti is precisely because of this commodification of urban grunge, that grunge has somehow become mainstream and really important as a source of commodification. And in a way it took me back to Raphael's comment earlier about Mary Douglas and dirt is matter out of place, and actually how dissatisfied I feel with that definition of dirt, which comes from thinking about waste in cities, but actually doesn't deal very well with how dirt becomes part of a process of commodification and industrialization or urbanization. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts around that area.
I think it's interesting that it's easy for us to talk about cleaning crews, and I mean one sort of wild suggestion would be to stop calling them cleaning crews in relation to graffiti removal and just call them removal crews, or talk about buffing. And I mean that's what artists and writers call it. They call it the buff. Cleaning is a concept that municipal authorities bring to the activity, and if you're cleaning something that is dirty, so cleaning is premised on the idea that there's dirt that has to be removed. So that's ideological. We don't have to think of it like that. We can talk about it as choosing to remove graffiti, and then that takes the dirt issue out of the equation. I mean, in terms of cities, dirt and cities go hand in hand, but dirt has always been troubling in cities. So social reformers saw dirt as something that had to be controlled. You can't get rid of it, but you can control it. And so I think we see traces of that in a lot of local councils, where I've sort of gone through most of the council authorities in Australia and looked at where they position their graffiti management strategies. The majority of them put them in the waste and cleansing departments of the councils. There might also be an art and culture policy that might mention permissioned murals, but most councils associate it with waste. And so that's been going on for a while. That's more than a decade. It's been like that. So that's embedded in a municipal way of thinking. And again, that might be something that would be useful to try and leave behind.
Yeah, that sounds like a great proposition. Thank you. I can't see anybody, but I'm expecting that some people might have their hands up with questions. I can just about, somebody's emerging through the light here. Oh, sorry, here. Yeah.
Hello. I'm a graffiti writer, started in the 70s and 80s from the Bronx, and I've witnessed the whole thing from its inception. And one thing you kind of missed was Cost was never imprisoned. He was given a couple hundred hours of community service.
Sorry.
What was revelatory and speaks to your point about the difference in valuation was that his partner Revs, who avoided prosecution, both of them ceased doing what they were doing for many years. However, Cost got a Village Voice cover not too long ago and started to be like, I want to be in galleries now and cash in on my street legacy. The authorities won't let you walk in both worlds. Another good case in point is Revoke in LA, who did all the billboards, beautiful stuff everywhere, started to do galleries and corporate gigs. He's in jail with like $180,000 bail. So had to move to Detroit because, you know, he was a pariah in his own home city. You know, what was interesting was he was prosecuted for doing this very, Coachella is a big festival in California. He did a big hit that everybody coming into Coachella could see. They spent like $40,000, which the town was like 300 miles away from LA where he was based. And they spent 40 grand like watching every move he made till he finally made a wrong move. They arrested him and he was like, wow, they could have painted over what I did for $30 worth of paint. Instead, they spent $40,000 to eradicate what I did. It's just that when the authorities that want to control the environment see somebody getting money or some kind of acclamation from the masses, they want to shut you down worse than anything.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it fits with the artist that I mentioned who's in court tomorrow in Melbourne. So he has had a lot of mainstream art success. Some of his works are sold at auction. So it's he did the Ned Kelly stencil. So perhaps increasing public success in the art world prompts some police officer goes, yeah, I remember that guy. That guy used to do endless stencils around Melbourne. Let's see if we've got any photographs on file. Same with Lister. You know, as he gets more and more successful and his paintings sell for higher sums, then you know the stakes go up. I mean, it's one reason why some people say to me, like, do you think Banksy's really worried about being arrested? Yes, I think so, because that kind of the higher the profile in many ways, the greater the incentive for the authorities to have a go. And you're right with Cost. I think, I mean, the news reports made a great deal of the fact that the police officers searched his Porsche Cayenne and found glue and paper in the back. But what was so strange was that the police felt so strongly about it that they had a press conference where on the table they had laid out, you know, their haul from busting him, and it was as if it was a gun haul or a drugs bust, and they were like, look, we have paper and glue.
Thank you. There's another question here.
Thanks, Alison. Yes, you're right about the Australian case. I'm working with Kurt and
Cameron.
Hi. And we've just handed in a big report to the City of Sydney, and you know, so long as we could say things to the planners like, we'll give you less work, when you go to the councillors, we'll make it cheaper. But the people in cleaning actually came back and said, well, no, you've got to call it cleaning. You can't call it curating. You've got to call it cleaning. But the real question I wanted to ask you was about your Proposition 4, which was about it's complex to try and work out what's legal and illegal. And obviously you're a criminologist and you've come at this very much today with a legal context. But tomorrow we're going to talk about legal works, and you mentioned legal works around the corner from your street there with the adnate piece. And I was just wondering if there was room for you to think about stepping back from the legal illegal and thinking about how those pieces relate to each other without that legal framing.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason for showing that little section of street was actually to, and I didn't obviously sort of draw that out properly, was actually to show that a streetscape looks the way it does, and that the legal illegal status might not be at all obvious, and so that what the spectator has is a set of assumptions, a set of reactions, maybe knowledge, maybe they know something about the area, maybe they don't, but a lot of policy in relation to graffiti and street art comes about from those reactions to the street art where there isn't that certainty. So I guess my proposition is about what does precision do to the debates, because the debates probably are based on a lot of hasty reactions.
Alison, thank you again for a wonderful and very illuminating talk. My question is more to do with where you've got graffiti writing and street art that is pretty unambiguous and actually very threatening and divisive. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could care to comment on where you see evidence that the perpetrators wish to intimidate, wish to stake out territory, wish to maintain divides in society, and actually in some cases that I've seen have actually decided to celebrate the fact they've caused harm to another group.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are two examples that come up frequently that are almost like outlier examples, and so I guess what I'm doing is has been to a certain extent generalizing. So I've been doing one of the things I've said that we shouldn't do, but needs must in a talk and all that. But hate graffiti is one of the outliers. The other one that almost everyone agrees on is like Arab Spring graffiti and so on, or the Berlin Wall, where those are attributed value that transcends any kind of social debate. So people tend to say, yeah, the Berlin Wall was wonderful and the graffiti was an important part of registering protest against it, or the Arab Spring graffiti was so important in those democratic uprisings. And hate graffiti, again, there's a certain unambiguity to how people react to it. It's very hard to make an argument for the social value of hate graffiti, and I wouldn't really want to be the person that tries, although I heard someone argue that it was all marks in public space and we should, deal with them on a case-by-case basis. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that hate graffiti, homophobic, anti-Semitic graffiti and so on, I think that's an example of assault. I don't think it's damage to property. I think it's directed at a person or a group, and they're using a particular means. They could use noise, they could use fists and so on, but they're using pain. And so I would actually categorize it as assault as an interpersonal crime rather than having anything to do with property.
Thank you.
Hi.
Sorry, can you put your hand up? I can't see where you are. Okay, fine.
Hello?
Sorry.
Hi.
No, sorry.
Hi. Fascinating talk, Alison. I just wanted to know that given modern graffiti's relationship with the
hip-hop and hip-hop culture in 70s urban spaces like New York and what have you. What's your opinion on what you think about the relationship between graffiti now and ethnicity? Because so far the discussion has been rather race neutral,
Yes.
i.e. white.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know where are we at with that, and what is there any significance today where race and graffiti is concerned?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. I mean, it's such a huge part of graffiti's history. So, you know, it's important to keep coming back to that. It's, I guess you could talk about class as well. So a lot of graffiti began, someone said earlier this morning, began in struggle, like really, and struggle that came out of social disadvantage and poverty and so on. But what I think those things come together in the world of graffiti and hip hop, because graffiti and hip hop turned that struggle into something positive. So one of the people that I interviewed, I was lucky enough to meet Mayor 139, a guy called Carlos, and he was talking about growing up in the Bronx. And the cliched sort of social science growing up in the Bronx story was not what the story that he was telling me. His story was, how lucky was I to grow up in the Bronx and to have hip hop? And I don't say that in any kind of patronizing, like, ooh, you know, isn't it we can justify social disadvantage because of culture? I don't mean to do that at all, but rather to say that that story, that the way that those things exist together, we should always tell it, not in order to perpetuate it, but in order to kind of do honor to the people that came out of that. So that's the history of graffiti. Street art doesn't have that at all. It's who are the street art pioneers? Blake Lerat, white male, studied architecture by coincidence. Jeff Aerosol, white male. Banksy. I haven't met Banksy. I think he's probably white. People here probably know for sure, but I'm sure he's a white male, not a girl like that recent story said. So there are stories about gender, class, and ethnicity that are embedded in the histories of graffiti and street art. And, there's lots more to be said about all of them.
Thank you. Who else had their hand
It was
up?
me. I was going to raise a question about your account of affect and spectatorship. I think it's really original and interesting, and I just want to understand a bit more. So most of the work I've seen on affects and spectatorship sort of looks at the way people identify with what they see, so narcissistic identification, or they make meanings from those identifications in projective identification. And I want to understand, your comments about tagging. Is it that the people you interviewed didn't like it because they couldn't identify with it or make meaning? As in, is it seen as a bit selfish or a bit lacking in complexity? Or is there another reason that they didn't like it?
So my understanding of affect comes from Deleuze, mainly, and kind of post-Deleuzian philosophy and art theory, so Brian Masumi, and there's a really wonderful Australian writer called Jill Bennett who's written about Deleuze and images, and I've learned a lot from her. And so from her, she particularly takes this idea that affect, and this is Masumi's idea as well, affect is intensity. It's not about identification or so on. All of that comes after. Affect is the name for what happens in the body, first of all, when you have an encounter or you look at something. And it's pre-cognitive, and then cognition comes in. And cognition interprets the intensity in various ways. It might be a product of upbringing, of social status, of lack of understanding or education and so on, or familiarity with the what you're looking at and so on. So if I look at a tag, I don't go, But I'm perfectly willing to accept that there are lots of people who do look at a tag and they go, or, ugh. And it's really about how do you work out what noise comes out when you look at it. And so what was interesting in relation to tagging is that we could call it calligraphy, I guess. The calligraphy of the tag aesthetically produces a certain affect in people who don't have a framework of thinking through what's going on there. So where they just see it as, so that's why it gets called things like scroll, scribble. Daubing was used today. A daub is a term in art for something done without skill. So all of those sort of categories get invoked because of the affect that has been generated by the sight of the tag. Whereas, many people in this room, if you look at a tag, you don't think scroll, scribble, daub. You might think nice letter A, or you dropped the can a bit there, or something like that. So the gap between those is what fascinates me.
There was a question over here.
I just wanted to comment in terms of ethnicity and hate graffiti. In one of the graffiti worlds I was involved in, and had numerous crews, there was beef between crews, there was dissing and going over, there was respect, but the one commonality was any skinhead or neo-Nazi graffiti was immediately painted over by every crew.
Yep.
So it was a sort of self-policing within the world of street art and graffiti to simply not let that be visible on the walls that these people were engaged in. So I found that an interesting sort of enforced anti-racism, I suppose you could say.
I would add to that. But the people who do hate graffiti are probably not doing PCs and tags and so on. To the extent that we can generalize, they're probably different populations.